Here is the full speech based on the title Compliment or Ignorance. Trump asks English, speaking Liberian Prez, where'd you learn English? Shaped in the tone and style of Mike Johnson, measured, serious, rooted in principles, and without mentioning him or anyone by name. Respect in diplomacy is not just a courtesy, it is a currency. It is the very foundation upon which trust is built, alliances are formed, and peace is preserved. When world leaders gather, they are not merely exchanging handshakes and headlines. They are representing nations, legacies, histories, and in many cases, the hopes of people who have endured generations of struggle. Cultural awareness, then, is not a side note in diplomacy, it is a non-negotiable starting point. Without it, what should be a bridge becomes a barrier. Without it, honor can quickly turn into offense. Without it, dialogue turns into damage control. When a leader enters a room without knowing who sits across from them, without understanding the sacrifices that shaped that nation's path, without regard for their language, customs, or colonial scars, then diplomacy becomes hollow. It becomes performance without principle. To show respect is not merely to avoid insult, it is to intentionally dignify. It is to understand why Liberia speaks English. It is to know that their language is not a novelty. It is a testament to shared history, a history soaked in both pain and perseverance. It is to remember that what may sound surprising to one may be sacred to another. And in a world as interwoven as ours, ignorance is not an excuse. It is a liability. To lead effectively on the world stage, one must come prepared not only with policy, but with perspective, not only with strategy, but with sensitivity, not only with might, but with meaning. Diplomatic respect means walking into every encounter not with assumptions, but with humility. It means recognizing that titles and power do not grant us the right to belittle, however unintentionally. They obligate us to uplift, because when cultural awareness is absent from our diplomacy, what follows is not just misunderstanding. It is erosion, erosion of alliances, erosion of trust, erosion of the very credibility that makes leadership effective and sustainable. Language holds power, not just in its syllables and sounds, but in its assumptions. What we choose to say reflects what we consciously intend, but what we presume before we speak. That reveals the deeper framework through which we see others. That is where the weight of our words often resides, not in their volume, but in their origin. Every question we ask carries behind it a belief. Every statement we make reveals an internal map, what we know, what we think we know, and what we never considered. And when a leader, any leader, asks a foreign head of state, "Where did you learn English?" the true statement being made may not lie in the question at all, but in the presumption that preceded it. It presumes that fluency is unexpected. It presumes that competence is anomalous. It presumes, perhaps without intent, that certain people, from certain places, do not naturally belong at the table of international discourse, and that's where the danger lies. Because it is not the spoken word alone that wounds, it is the world it unveils. It is the unconscious categorization of others as outsiders in rooms they've already earned a seat in. It is the hidden hierarchy we sometimes impose when we fail to recognize that excellence exists far beyond the borders of our own experience. This is why language is not neutral, it shapes perception. It reveals posture, and in the context of diplomacy, it can build or break rapport. In the hands of the careless, language becomes a mirror of ignorance. But in the hands of the wise, language becomes a bridge, one that connects nations, honors heritage, and affirms the dignity of all who speak, regardless of accent, origin, or race. What we presume before we speak matters just as much as what we say aloud. Because diplomacy is not merely about communication, it is about comprehension, and comprehension demands more than knowledge. It demands humility. It demands the discipline to pause, to reflect, to ask ourselves, what am I assuming here, and what does that assumption say about me? That is the true test of leadership in a global era, not the ability to command attention with a statement, but the willingness to confront our own internal narratives before we speak them aloud. Continues indefinitely. As requested, there was a time, not so long ago, when the presence of an American leader in any international forum brought with it an undeniable weight. not simply because of military might or economic power, but because we were known as a nation that listened before we judged, observed before we acted, and sought understanding before issuing instruction. That reputation was not earned by noise. It was earned by restraint, by reflection, and by respect. You see, true strength in diplomacy doesn't come from dominating the room, it comes from dignifying those in it. It's easy to speak louder than the rest, but real leadership, comes from the discipline to hear voices that are often ignored, from the courage to learn before declaring, from the humility to sit in rooms where our power gives us a platform, but our listening gives us influence. And this is where we must understand the true nature of America's role in the world, not as a moral megaphone, but as a trusted steward, a nation that embodies liberty, yes, but also the responsibility that comes with it. Because when we speak too quickly, without context or care, we don't export wisdom. We export arrogance, and arrogance, even when well-intentioned, alienates the very people we're called to reach. When an American leader questions the legitimacy of another nation's knowledge or heritage without grasping its history, we risk not only insulting them, we risk diminishing ourselves, because to lecture without listening is to speak into a void. It produces noise, not change, resistance, not respect. Listening is not weakness, it is strategic, it is moral. It is what sets apart a nation that leads by example from a nation that demands obedience. And in this moment, the world does not need more commands. It needs conviction wrapped in compassion. It needs clarity delivered with care. We cannot presume that the world wants to be like us if we do not first show the world that we care to know them. Listening is not surrender, it is stewardship, and stewardship begins when we recognize that being heard is a universal human longing. When we offer others that dignity, we amplify our own voice not by volume, but by virtue. Our founders spoke often of self-government, of liberty, and of responsibility. But what is liberty without the discipline to understand others? What is responsibility without the willingness to hear the voices of those beyond our shores? What is diplomacy if not the sacred art of slowing down enough to listen before we speak? And so we must ask ourselves, not just in hindsight, but in preparation for the next encounter, are we listening? Or are we simply waiting for our turn to speak? Are we honoring the stories of other nations, or are we writing them off before we've read the first page? Because the measure of American greatness has never been in how many words we say, but in how many hearts we move. There's a profound difference between a misstep and a mistake of consequence, between a harmless oversight and a failure that echoes far beyond the moment. When a private citizen makes an uninformed comment, it may cause offense. But when a person in power, especially on the global stage, makes that same comment, it carries the weight of a nation behind it. And in that reality lies a sobering truth. Ignorance is no longer innocent when it holds power. Power amplifies everything, both wisdom and error, both grace and arrogance, both knowledge and naivety. The words of leaders are not confined to their mouths. They become signals to allies, to adversaries, to the forgotten and the watching world. And when those words reveal a lack of cultural understanding, a disregard for history, or an unfamiliarity with the people they address, the damage is not just personal, it is diplomatic, it is strategic, it is institutional. We must reject the comfortable illusion that good intentions cancel out harm, that a shrug and a smile can erase the sting of ignorance spoken from a podium, because whether intended or not, ignorance in the seat of authority becomes policy. It becomes posture, it becomes precedent, and that is not a burden we can afford to carry lightly, because when the powerful are unaware, they mislead, when the powerful assume, they insult, when the powerful don't know, but act as if they do more than misrepresent themselves. They misrepresent the nation they speak for. Leadership demands something higher. It demands that we do the work, that we study not just our own history, but the stories of others, that we speak not from assumption, but from understanding. And when we don't know, that we ask, not with casual disbelief, but with reverence, with curiosity, with a desire to honor rather than diminish. There is no virtue in not knowing what we should already know, especially when the answers are not hidden. They are public, documented, and deeply significant. When a nation like Liberia exists with historical ties to America, founded by freed slaves seeking liberty on distant soil, then to question its language is not merely ignorant, it is blind to a shared past that demands acknowledgement. Power, when left unexamined, becomes reckless, and ignorance, when given a platform, becomes contagious. The higher the platform, the greater the damage. A misinformed word at a campaign rally may cause controversy, but that same word spoken to a foreign dignitary in a room lined with flags and cameras can fracture alliances, embolden cynics, and undermine years of diplomatic progress. And so we return to this principle: authority requires awareness. It requires the discipline of preparation, the humility to admit what we do not know, and the integrity to correct it before the world corrects us. Because once a word is spoken, it cannot be unsaid. Once respect is lost, it cannot be demanded, it must be re-earned. Leadership is not defined by the size of a title, the height of a podium, or the sound of applause. It is measured over time by how we treat those we don't need to impress. It is defined not in how we elevate ourselves, but in how we regard others, especially when no one is demanding that we do so. True dignity in leadership is quiet. It doesn't seek the spotlight. It doesn't shout to be noticed. It is found in the subtle decisions, the unspoken gestures, the way a leader honors someone else's story, even when it differs from their own. Because in every encounter, every meeting with a foreign head of state, every handshake across difference, every exchange across cultures, there is a choice. A choice to humanize or to patronize, to dignify or to diminish, and history does not forget which path we choose. The leaders who are remembered with honor are not those who spoke the longest, but those who lifted others with their words. Not those who demanded respect, but those who gave it freely, because dignity is never something we can demand for ourselves while denying it to others. It shows up in the way we ask questions, in the assumptions we avoid, in the reverence we show toward those whose journeys we may not fully understand, but whose presence at the table is every bit as earned. Dignity means knowing that the person across from us represents not just a flag or a nameplate, but a people, a history, a soul. It means understanding that when we speak to them, we speak to generations behind them and possibilities ahead of them. And perhaps most critically, dignity in leadership is the ability to see another leader not through the lens of stereotype or surprise, but through the lens of shared humanity. Not as someone unexpected in a position of power, but as someone fully deserving of their seat, their voice, and their place in the global conversation. We often speak of American values: freedom, justice, opportunity. But these values lose their credibility when we fail to extend them in how we treat others, when our tone dismisses more than it uplifts, when our posture conveys superiority instead of solidarity, when our curiosity becomes condescension. This is not merely a matter of political correctness, it is a matter of moral consistency. The world is watching not only what we do, but how we regard those we do it with. And in that watching, they decide whether we are a nation to trust, to emulate, to align with, not because we are always right, but because we strive always to respect. Respect, after all, is not weakness. It is wisdom. It is the realization that no leader is elevated by making others feel small, and no nation earns moral authority by treating others as anomalies rather than equals. When we regard others with dignity, we reinforce our own. When we lead with humility, we invite unity. When we treat every person, every leader, every culture, every nation with respect, we become more than powerful. We become principled.